Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us to today's special members only event. We hope all of you are staying safe through these very challenging times. I'm very pleased to introduce today's program featuring Dan Eberhart, CEO of Canary LLC, one of the largest privately held oilfield services companies in the U.S. Dan is also a member of our board of directors. He will be discussing the implications of the G20 backed agreement, the largest oil supply agreement in history. Now, Dan, it's time for me to turn this over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Kim, and thank you everyone for tuning in from your homes, presumably, or wherever you are. I'd just like to start. So my name is Dan Eberhart. I'm the CEO of Canary. We're an oilfield services firm. We're probably about 95% in the U.S., 5% international. We operate all throughout the different oil plays in the United States. Longtime member of the LA World Affairs Council, and I hope that everyone is getting through this as best you can, and that everyone is staying safe. So what I'm going to talk about today is the kind of the oil markets in general and how we've been affected by the crisis and what this means, and then specifically the OPEC deal and the G20 Energy Ministers Summit and kind of what's transpired since then. So to start with, the oil market generally worldwide is about, roughly speaking, about 100 million barrels a day of demand. What's since happened is with the virus and with people not driving, not flying, manufacturing being largely shut down, and all the other lack of economic activity that I'm sure everyone else is aware of, is we've had gigantic demand destruction. So demand destruction has been about, we think right now is about 25 or 30 million barrels a day. So this is completely unprecedented, completely without parallel in history, and has really left people in our industry scrambling a lot, as many industries are scrambling right now. So many companies, so the rig count has fallen by about almost half in a span of 3 weeks, which is again unprecedented. The last economic contraction in 2015, 2016, it took about 20 months to happen what's happened in about the last 3 weeks. So it's just a quite chaotic period where everybody is laying down rigs, stopping drilling, and trying to figure out, where the floor is and what companies' different reactions should be. Nearly every company in our space, including us and our competitors, have had to lay off people, have had to reduce wages, and have really had to tighten our belt. And we really don't know where the bottom is and how this is going to function and how this is going to kind of play out. So where that leads us is to a coming problem with storage. So in the past, we've always had enough storage, and when the price of oil goes low, when demand falls, the storage kind of ticks up. And this is kind of a market clearing mechanism and something that allows for the supply and demand to kind of get in alignment and to solve for the free market to solve. Well, this is really happening too quickly with this pandemic for the free market to solve, or at least quickly, and for supply and demand to cross and for storage to be the solution. So the oil and gas industry has really been freaking out about saving itself and saving jobs in a time of dwindling demand. But also this storage problem has created really a secondary epidemic or secondary problem. So we are probably about a month away from the oil running, just flat running out of storage. So if you'll think about this, I was trying to think of a good analogy, and I haven't quite been able to come up with the perfect one, but this is similar to, there's a river flowing and the ocean is closed. And the oil industry is right now grappling with what to do with this, because these wells are, it's not like a water faucet or like gasoline at the pump. This is something that there's been a great deal of engineering, a great amount of fracking, a great amount of effort into getting these wells started that flow into gathering systems, that flow into transmission lines, that flow into refineries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, no one ever has tried to reverse this process and stop the oil from flowing. What generally happens is you stop drilling and you wait for the wells decline curves to fall over time, and that clears supply and demand. Well, in this case, we just don't have enough time for that. So a normal well will decline. You know, your best day of a well, your IP rate, your initial production is going to be the best day of the well. And so you're looking at decline curves of 15 to 30% in the first year, and then on down from that. So generally, if you stop drilling, that will correct for an oversupply situation. Well, this is really much, much more drastic than anything anyone has ever seen before. And we're literally analysts are trying to add up, well, if you store oil in pipelines, if you store it in tanker cars, if you store it on ships, how much additional storage space is there? And there's somewhere around 1 billion barrels, but we're already at about 800 million barrels full. And this is rapidly filling at a rate of probably about 30 million barrels per day. So you can see the math is quite stark, and the industry is really trying to figure out, how do you stop this river from flowing, and how do you slow it down drastically so that supply and demand can meet in the short term. So the industry has been really trying to come up with a response, a coordinated response that will work. Typically, oil markets are led by OPEC, or at least putatively, which is a cartel that includes, it's Saudi Arabia and 10 or 11 other people, but Saudi Arabia is really the main driver. And then there's now something called Opec Plus, which is basically OPEC plus Russia. So what happened about a month ago is Russia and Saudi Arabia said, we want to do these cuts, and we want to take this amount of oil off the market, and we want you to participate this much, Russia. Russia said no. So Saudi Arabia said, well, if you're not going to participate, Russia, we're actually going to go the other way, and we're going to flood the market with an additional 3 million barrels a day. So Saudi Arabia usually produces, generally speaking, 8, 9, 10 million barrels a day. They decided to ramp it up to 12 million barrels a day and flood the market. Russia said, okay, that's fine. We'll play that game too. We will also flood the market. So this sent oil tanking from kind of mid 50s to mid 40s, and then it kind of fell out of bed and is hovering just about $20 today. Well, this price is basically apocalyptic or cataclysmic for the U.S. industry. And you know, in the medium term, the U.S. industry won't exist at $20 or $25 oil. So, you know, and in the middle of the country, this is something like 6 to 8 million jobs, and close to 12 million jobs indirectly that potentially will disappear or largely disappear if the current economic situation continues. Hopefully it doesn't, but that's where we're sitting today. So going back to OPEC, so OPEC Plus flooded the market, the price crashed, but in the meantime, the U.S., which is full of a bunch of smaller companies than these state-owned oil companies and some bigger ones, really went into high gear on cutting to try to reduce demand or reduce supply and reduce expenses for these companies to save themselves and to save the market, while OPEC spent a month basically pouring oil into the market, pushing the price down. But all of this was really a short-term game because, as everyone in the industry knows, we're about out of storage. So talking big and pumping all this oil is really a circle to nowhere, and the industry really needed cuts to begin with. My personal opinion is that Saudi Arabia and Russia cooked this up to get the U.S. to kind of de facto participate in the cartel and participate in OPEC by taking supply off the market without them overtly agreeing to do so. That's my opinion and a theory, but it's something that's out there. The OPEC then basically said, look, we're going to do these cuts, but now we not only want Russia on board, we want the whole world on board. We want everyone on board, including the biggest producers outside of OPEC Plus would be the US, Canada, Norway, and Brazil. And there's some others, but those are the main four not in OPEC. In a general sense, the three biggest world producers are the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. If you take the 3-year average, roughly 10 million barrels a day. in the last 12 months, the U.S. has been the world's leading producer, but Saudi Arabia has more capacity probably when they want to. It's kind of a general thinking. So the U.S., we have antitrust laws and anti-collusion laws and can't really participate in the way that Saudi Arabia was asking us to. And Saudi Arabia also pushed on the U.S. government to have the oil industry completely excluded from this $2 trillion stimulus, the SBA loans, the paycheck protection stuff, the corporate guarantees. Saudi Arabia actually wanted the U.S. oil industry to be completely left out of that stuff, and the administration kind of balked at that. This is my understanding from from being in communication with the administration and others. There was also supposed to be a $3 billion appropriation in the $2 trillion stimulus bill to add oil to our strategic petroleum reserve, but this was blocked by the administration wanted this, but this was blocked by Congress and hasn't ended up happening. So the administration found $850 million in some other budget that they're using to add to the strategic petroleum reserve. The government typically has, and this is in kind of salt caves in Louisiana, we have about 650 million barrels in a 700 million barrel capacity taverns where we store oil. Unfortunately, to be honest, the U.S. has kind of a history of buying high and selling low. The federal government does with oil. This would actually be a situation where they could do the opposite, I think, and also put at least a little bit of a floor under the price, which would help the U.S. oil and gas industry, be able to float or survive through this period. And so anyway, I think a little bit of that's going to happen. I think there will be some appropriation, the fourth stimulus package, but it hasn't happened yet. The administration is also taking the completely unprecedented move of leasing some of the storage space to private producers. That's never been done before, and it potentially gives the private producers an output for where to store oil while they're trying to get the wells to slow down and to get supply and demand to match. Refineries are taking in April about 3.8 million barrels a day less than they were taking in March. And so that's a reduction of around 30%, which I think is the refiners trying to match demand, but it doesn't really solve the problem for the oil and gas producers and the storage problem in the short term. So going back to OPEC. So OPEC wanted everyone to participate, and they worked really hard. There were several meetings. This is notoriously difficult. People try to cheat. People try to talk around these quotas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Trump was very involved with trying to get a deal between OPEC and Russia and the U.S. to the extent possible. And many, many people were really wanting a deal here. They came up with a deal last week that took, as reported, 9.7 million barrels a day off the market in May, and then for May and June, and then seeing that fall to 7.7 million barrels a day the rest of the year. It's a little bit of a misnomer because that's off a November 18 baseline, and stay with me here. So it's really 9.7 million barrels from where they were in November of 2018. And today they're about 6 million barrels higher. So that's about 15 million barrels. And then the thinking is that there's another 3.4 million barrels in additional cuts from the rest of the world. And this is what was discussed at the G20 energy ministers meeting. And another kind of caveat to this is Mexico only agreed to cut 100,000 as opposed to the 400,000 the Saudis wanted them to cut. So that's why it's 9.7, not 10. There's two strands of thought here with Mexico. One is that the cartels are skimming 10 or 20% of the oil and basically told the president that if they cut much, they're going to be not happy with him. I don't know how substantiated that is or isn't. The other is more factual based. Mexico has hedged oil into the mid 40s. So whatever the price is, as long as they're selling it for the rest of the year, they're going to get in the lower to mid 40s. So they don't really care. The price fall isn't really hurting Mexico as much. Maybe they're the most clever of all of us in this kind of oil and gas sphere. So moving on, so the market's reaction to this was honestly, shockingly, basically a yawn or kind of rejected. So oil, which is trading, in a $22 to $24 per barrel bandwidth for WTI, actually plunged 11% yesterday, which was the first market day after this deal supposedly happened on Easter. So with OPEC, so the market has basically rejected that and said, look, you're going to take kind of the 9.7 plus the 6, so 15.7 plus 13.4, so roughly 19 million barrels a day off the market, and oil fell. What does that mean? That means the market rejected this, and the market thinks, look, that's not enough. We think the demand destruction is more, that storage rates are going to are going to continue to rise, and the price of oil is going to continue to fall. So that to me is just shocking, because the biggest deal ever by OPEC is something like 2 million barrels. So to see this kind of effectively a 15 million barrel cut from OPEC plus participation from the rest of the world, and the price to still fall, means that the cartel is really undershooting what they're trying to do and hasn't done enough. And I think the math basically means that unless the situation changes and the world opens soon and demand comes roaring back, which I think it will, but I think it's going to be, 30, 45, 60 days longer than where we sit right now to even start coming back. And who knows about, I think people will drive personally, but I think airline traffic may be at a severely reduced level. And jet fuel is typically about a 30% of the consumption of oil and gas. So I think that the price of oil falling means that OPEC and these other producers are going to have to come back to the table for more cuts, and are going to have to agree to do more or act independently, because I think there's just going to be nowhere to store it. So floating storage rates have quadrupled in the past month. Land storage rates have over tripled, and the math shows we're going to be running out of it. Refiners are taking less and less oil every day, and there's a huge problem going on. So yesterday, the Texas Railroad Commission, which is a quirk of history and whatever, controls oil and gas in Texas, had a hearing about implementing a quota system. And I testified at this hearing. I testified against the quota system. I think that there's clearly way too much oil, but I think that if you don't have a customer, you shouldn't produce if you don't have a pipeline that will take it, you shouldn't produce the oil. And everyone should be able to control their own company and respond to free market sources, respond to their banks, respond to their shareholders, and everyone has a duty to act responsibly, but the government shouldn't force feed a quota system down everyone's throat. The Texas Railroad Commission has a history of having quotas in the 1930s and the 1970s, but those were different times when the U.S. had more market share in the worldwide oil and gas industry. Now we're at 10%. We were probably in the mid 30s back then in the 70s, and we're in a really different situation now where the Middle East can control things a bit better. And so I think that this is really history being written, and I think that it's, I think there's a plethora of horrible but intellectually interesting economic situations developing, as we all kind of live through this pandemic and try to, move day by day with our families and our friends and our loved ones. But, the oil and gas industry has a significant issue going on right now with no sales is one thing, lack of demand is one thing, but where are we going to put this stuff? And the math shows us literally running out of space in a matter of weeks with the shut-ins going on, especially in the U.S. and the Middle East, which is really where most of the production is. Also, I would like to just kind of say on a tangent, going to the more world affairs component of this, the U.S. having a an independent oil and gas industry, I think, is good for a number of reasons. First of all, it allows us to project foreign policy and not be dependent on the Middle East. So I think that it's difficult to put a price on that. But in the 70s, OPEC brought US to heel and the economy to a screeching halt by starving us of oil. Well, you know what? We've got our own resources, and that won't happen to us in the future. Second of all, things like where we can put sanctions on Russia, we can put sanctions on Iran, we can starve Iran to the point that we can get them to agree to the nuclear deal that Obama did, or us being able to react, which I would have liked to seen us react more forcefully, but to Saudi Arabia with what happened with the Khashoggi murder, or anything like that, and us being able to use arms sales to Saudi Arabia as a carrot and a stick, foreign policy wise. We wouldn't be able to do those things if we didn't have our own energy. We also have been able to sell natural gas into Europe and block this Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Russia wants to the Middle East, to Germany, to sell gas to Germany while also screwing the Ukraine. We've been able to block that with soft power in Eastern Europe because the US can assure these countries that we can get them LNG and natural gas, which is also a product of the shale revolution. So all of these kind of power projection things we would not be able to do. Also, we are now exporting oil and gas, and I don't know, who knows what the statistics are now, but this brought something like $350 to $400 billion of hard currency into the US in 2019. So this reduces the trade deficit, brings hard currency into the country, and it's really, with all this trade war with China, we're talking about the agricultural impact and soybeans and this and that. Well, the oil and gas numbers are really 15 or 20 times larger. So it really is a huge, exporting crude is a very good way to bring hard currency into the US when, especially at a time when we basically manufacture very, very little. And so really all we have to export is kind of softer things like services. This really allows us to bring hard currency into the country, which I think is a good thing, because generally America buys stuff from other places and exports services, but really produces very little hard goods that bring in hard currency overseas, especially on a net basis. So I see a lot of good in a domestic oil and gas industry aside from just the jobs provided. And I think that, if you're into economics and into the market, I think this is an interesting corner right now to watch and to try to understand, what's going on. I mean, I guess, hotels, airlines, many industries have got all kinds of negativity right now. I definitely feel that in my personal life. So, but oil and gas is an interesting neck of the woods, and this period is, very, very negative for us. I would say that, I look for, if the price stays at the current rate, I would say that, 75% of my competitors will be bankrupt by the end of the year. So I don't say that with a lot of glee, but it's, raining awful hard in our industry as it is throughout many pockets of the economy in the country. So anyway, that's what I had to share with you guys, and I'm happy to take questions about this and what they're trying to do in DC to help our industry, or the foreign policy aspects, or anything you guys might not have understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was really, really interesting. And we have a lot of questions coming in, so I will just get started right at the top. So what will the massive losses in oil revenue for the Saudis in Russia and Russians, how will that affect their economies and politics? Is political instability in those regimes at risk?
I would say it won't create political instability, because what the Saudis and the Russians have done, and it's I think this is most interesting in the case of Russia. So I went actually to Russia with the LA World Affairs Council, right, which is a great trip, and a few years ago. And when we put the sanctions on Russia, they basically went very, very conservative on the amount of debt they had and the amount of cash they had. So And the Saudis have always carried a lot of cash. So the Russians and the Saudis each have something like $400 or $500 billion in cash. And remember, their economies are smaller than ours. So this is a magnificent amount of money. So they're really saying, look, for them, this is a concept of economic dumping. If weaker competitors, i.e. the US in general, or other places around the world can go out of business, they can harvest greater profits long-term by dealing with the negativity that's happening right now. The Saudis, I think, need something like $80 oil to balance their budget, but I don't think they really care. I think that MBS is a strong man and trying to weaken competitors where he can. I think Putin also thinks in that way. And so I don't think they did this. I think they did this knowing they have huge cash stockpiles and they can hurt competitors more than it will hurt themselves. This is my read of it. In places like Nigeria or Venezuela, though, yeah, this could absolutely increase political instability, I think.
Why do you think Saudi Arabia insisted that Mexico be part of the final agreement when its contribution was so insignificant?
It's definitely insignificant. I think they wanted everyone to contribute. I think they get really, really frustrated with freeloaders, and I think that MBS, the new leader or putative leader, is excessively focused on that. There also is a sense that in the last oil bust, they cut production and US shale didn't. And so US shale increased market share. So I think that the Saudis in particular and OPEC specifically, they don't want to lose market share in this pandemic. They think everybody should be hurt equally.
Interesting. Where does oil production in greater Los Angeles take place? And are these regions at risk for fires, for example?
Sure. So as you kind of might imagine, it's very difficult to, near impossible to drill in Los Angeles County, but there's still a lot of productive wells. Many of these have these kind of faux or fake buildings around them to kind of mask what they are, to be blunt. But we operate out of Bakersfield, and still have quite a bit of work there. And in Bakersfield, the wells are usually pretty shallow, especially relative to Texas or somewhere else. But I don't feel like the risk of fire is really that great. And typically, I've never heard of like an oil well location catching on fire. And I've only really rarely heard of an actual well catching on fire, but usually when they catch on fire, it's subsurface. So it's not on surface anyway. But I've been doing this 20 years and I don't know of a surface fire.
Thank you. One question, why did Congress block the $3 billion for the SPR? And maybe you can explain that a little bit too.
Sure. So, I think it was Pelosi just didn't want to spend the money on it. And I think the industry is kind of wants, I've been on a lot of talks like with the White House, with the National Economic Council, et cetera, et cetera. And the industry wants help, but doesn't want to ask for a bailout, right? And so the thought process was an SPR purchase is a way to put maybe a floor under the oil price, also a way to get a good deal for taxpayers. So I personally think it makes sense, but I think at some point they're just these lawmakers were just kind of horse trading what made it in the $2 trillion stimulus package. I will say that the industry feels like in the stimulus there's really not much for us because the Paycheck Protection Plan and the SBA loans don't really do anything for incentivizing oil companies to drill or solving the storage space problem that we've got. Those are the problems in our industry. So it doesn't really matter if the companies, if companies like ours have money through that program or not, and we're a little big for it, but it doesn't really help stimulate demand from our customers. So, our industry feels like what we need is storage space or, something like this deal with OPEC or SPR purchases are things that could help our industry remain solvent in the short term.
From a narrow US perspective, sorry, my thing just jumped.
No worries.
Apologies, technical issues. From a narrow US perspective, given that we consume more oil than we produce, and with inflation in mind, isn't it better that we have low oil prices? Doesn't low oil prices help push down inflation and also aid businesses that use oil?
Yeah, absolutely, that's true. Although I would say that, and again, I think you see this in kind of Trump's remarks. The politicians always want lower gas prices, and that logic that it's better for the economy is true. I think we're outside of that band. I think that's a normal band of kind of economic cycle, mild recession, bull market, whatever. I think that we're at a completely different situation with this pandemic. The problem is, if you extrapolate this out, are oil prices low in April? Yes. Are oil prices low in June? Yes. But if our industry goes away, then if the domestic industry goes away, first of all, there's going to be that's 8% of the jobs in the US that are going to go away. Second of all, we're then importing oil, so we've got less of a stick on this foreign policy stuff with the Middle East or with Russia. And third of all, the reason the Russians and the Saudis like this is to push US people out of business so they can raise the price later. So will it help the economy in the next 60 days? Yeah, to the extent people are driving or flying. But, are you going to enjoy paying 3 times as much at the pump in 18 months if the US industry goes completely under? What's your timeline for the win? Also, I will say that it's traditionally been true that the US has consumed more than we produced, but that has really changed in the last 3 years. So that logic and that line of thinking is really a little outdated given the current data set. We are now exporting oil, which we have started in 2015. We're exporting oil, which is bringing hard currency into the US.
Thank you. How do you see the economy as a whole recovering from COVID?
I wish better. Yeah, so I've been struggling with this, and I have we have an awful lot of people on our team, and I've been thinking about this a lot. Honestly, I think that we come back. I think that when we open, we've got an economy that's 60 to 80% the size it was, depending on how long we stay closed. But I think that we're going to have a very high growth rate coming out of that. But I think it's 24 months from when we open until we have an economy the same size as where we are. I think that we're going to have a deflationary environment. And so I think that it's going to require, a push to the economy that only Zeus could give to make this work. Because I think that people are going to be extremely reluctant to buy vehicles, to buy a house, to buy a vacation house, to invest in their business, to add on to their factory. I think people are going to be awful skittish to do those kinds of things. Will they travel to see grandkids? Yes. Will we go to the grocery store? Of course. We want to go to a restaurant? Yes. But these kind of capital intensive purchases for families and for companies, I think people are going to think 3 times before pulling the trigger, and they're going to be awful gun shy. So that's going to keep huge sectors of the economy from getting off the ground.
As a follow-up to that, do you think declines in air travel, particularly internationally, and commuter auto traffic as the virtual home office becomes more common, will become the normal, and particularly US demand will decline long term?
I mean, I think we're in the fog of war, and it's difficult to say, but I think we're going to see some of that. And I think that, I've always thought we could use like more staggered times to make the traffic flow less. I mean, I'm sure we've all been stuck on the 405, right?
Yeah.
Pretty awful. But I will say that, so I also own a construction business in Norwalk, and we do stuff in the street. And, we're very busy right now and are using this kind of light traffic as a time to actually get some infrastructure work done. And so hopefully that's a net positive for folks. But yeah, I think we could see all kinds of demand shifts. I was thinking the other day about, with social distancing and all this, is this going to date movies, right? Where you'll be able to tell if it was a pre-coronavirus or post-coronavirus movie based on how close everyone is. So I think we're going to see all kinds of unintended consequences and kind of new ways to do things that maybe we haven't thought of. If, I think, hotel rooms are going to need to be cleaned differently. I think that spacing in restaurant may need to change. And I think that, we may need to rework the concept of the fire marshal code limit or population limit for a building to reflect this kind of social distancing. And, we're going to need to do a lot of thinking as a society, I think.
Yeah, and some of those restaurants might not be able to operate if they could only, fill half of their restaurant. So that's going to be a big challenge for them.
It's going to really change. Businesses that operate on a revenue per square foot is going to completely change a lot of those kind of dynamics.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. I watch shows now and I'm like, oh, they're way too close to each other, or they shouldn't be touching that door.
Yeah.
So I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Does the reduction of oil prices have any adverse effect on Iran's production of oil and China's acquisition of the surplus oil in the market? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what's going on with Asia as well.
Yeah, so China has actually China created and has been adding to their strategic petroleum reserve for the past 2 years and during this pandemic. So China is really kind of loaded up. And again, the US has got really a bad history of buying high and selling low for the citizens in their strategic petroleum reserve. China seems to be doing it more right. With Iran, man, I mean, their oil and gas industry just can't get a win, right? I just can't see with what Saudi Arabia has done. I find it really hard that buyers would even want to talk to them, because the Saudis keep dropping the price lower, lower, and lower to keep the Asian customers and cut the US companies out. So again, they've really used this strategy to hurt particularly US shale, because they're trying to push as many US shale companies out of business. But I can't imagine that the Iranians, why would you do business with them if they're persona non grata, if you've already got 40 people trying to sell you what you need one of?
Yeah. And anything on the Asian economy or the Asian markets too, because I know you tweeted about that this morning. Everyone should follow him on Twitter, by the way, Dan K. Eberhart on Twitter.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and if anybody interested in my comments, please find me there. I would appreciate it. So, yeah, I think the Asian markets are opening, but I think it's been slower and more muted than people expect. We have factories in China, and we just started getting production from them about 2 weeks ago from them getting over this virus. So they shut down for Lunar New Year and basically just reopened a few weeks ago, and we're just starting to get shipments in from our suppliers in China. But I think that it just shows, like, you've got to be very cautionary. Singapore basically reopened the schools and then closed them again. And I think that you've got to really we need to really watch what they do well and what they don't do well as they reopen their markets. I also, to be blunt, don't trust their data.
So I've been thinking about this a little bit lately too, and neither of us were old enough to have been around for it. But what do you know of any comparisons to the oil crisis in 1973 and how that recovery would compare to what might happen now?
Yeah, so, and I mean, I've studied that, and there was a lot of this discussed in this Texas Railroad Commission hearing I was a part of yesterday. So first of all, we produce our own oil, so we are not going to be held hostage by the Middle East at all, because we have our own industry, at least at the moment. Second of all, we just have too much. We flat have too much oil. The biggest problem in the industry is, how are we going to stop production enough to not overfill the storage facilities? I mean, I can't kind of over dramatize. I think of the price of oil as this is not something that stops at zero. I think it's unlikely, but possible that oil could be negative in 45 days, because these people are going to be looking at, this is what I have to pay for storage. We'll just take it, because I don't have the cash to stop the well. I don't have the cash to store it. I mean, again, this is really an unprecedented situation. I don't think the bankruptcy courts they're not set up for this. Like, when the company's out of money and throws its hands up, who is giving them the money to stop the well? The government's going to have to, right? But I don't know that we're quite going to get there. But this is way too close to comfort to that kind of a disaster.
Yeah. In view of the low oil prices, will the federal government move to more aggressively support renewable energy technologies?
I think the government will react slowly and on something like that right now. And I think that this, if anything, I think lower oil prices push greater adoption of renewables offline or out further because the fuel price is cheaper. I think the best thing for renewables and the quickest adoption is with a higher oil price, I think. I will say though, one thing that I think folks should be really cognizant of right now is, so we have this thing in the business called flaring. Nobody flares oil, but people flare natural gas, which is releasing methane into the air, which is not good. So, and generally speaking, when people stop the industry from building pipelines, a lot of oil companies decide to flare the natural gas. And so that puts methane in the air, which is bad. And I think that the methane that's going to be released in the air is going to increase a lot with the low price. And typically North Dakota is worse on flaring and Texas is better. And those are the two with the biggest economics. But there's a lot of discussion that one thing the government could do to lower production is to tighten the restrictions on flaring in the short term or possibly for the long term. And that would make oil companies shut in wells. But typically the flaring is so about, you know, an oil well is not just oil. Like, it's not like you turn on the faucet and water comes out. There's oil, there's mud, there's water, there's natural gas, a bunch of different stuff. Generally, you want the oil a lot, you want the natural gas a little bit, you don't want the rest of it. We separate it, clean it, whatever. And what's put back into the ground is just water and mud, and it's been kind of purified many times over. And it's salt water that comes up, not fresh water. The associated gas is going to eventually fall as the oil wells fall. The gas you get because you're drilling an oil well and just happen to get will eventually fall. But in the short term, I think there's going to be a lot of flaring because no one needs it and the pipelines are full, and we couldn't build enough pipelines in good times.
Okay, and this will be our final question, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
As the United States is the world's reserve currency to settle all oil transactions, how will this reduction in cash flow volume affect the velocity/value of the dollar?
So, I mean, I think that what's going on in the oil markets will generally be swamped by the dollar being the currency of last resort. So when all economies fall, people run to the dollar because it's reserve currency. And I think that's still going to be true. And that's going to be more negative impact on interest rates. The main problem that I see happening is these emerging markets that are petrostates that have borrowed in dollars are just flat not going to be able to pay. And so I don't know if someone else is going to bail them out, or, you know, it's hard to keep track of all the bailouts, right? But that and state governments needing money are going to be the next shoes to drop. But I think the dollar, I think when it's raining, the dollar is stronger, and I think it's raining awful hard right now. So as many problems as we have in our economy, we are capable of great stimulus, and the government has shown a propensity to do that. And I think that's going to make dollars rise in value relative to lesser currencies.
Dan, thank you so much for taking time. And like I said, you guys should follow him on Twitter. I've been following him for a while, and it's been really helpful to kind of keep up to date on all of these changes. So Kim, we will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica.